I found sources about the history of the ZMKR, about how my Koryu line, Musoshinden no Ryu, was invented very late century and how this all fitted together. So I was very realistic about what I was doing. I wasn't trying to replicate any fantasy about samurais. I was, from the very start, exposed to the European Jodo. And because I'm lucky enough to speak a couple of languages, I was able to just go over there and start speaking to all of them. Because I really like this cross-disciplinary approach. And because of my multicultural upbringing, I've always reached out to other countries and other people as different as possible as me, just to understand their perspective, because this is so enriching.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Tokuskai Inside Look podcast. Today we're speaking with Stephan Naji from Paris, France. Stephan has been training for over 17 years with extended stints in the US while teaching at New York University. Stephan holds the rank of Iaido Godan and Jodo Yondan and has earned several tournament honors, including a series of golds and silvers in 2005 and 6 at the European Iaido Championships, the French Nationals, and the BKA International Taikai. He also recently achieved Sandan Bronze at the Ishido Cup in 2018 for Jodo. In this wide-ranging conversation, we talk about how he lucked upon an Iaido dojo in the very beginning, about different styles of teaching and leading in a dojo, about the various ways in which the social aspect, the community, and the feeling of family can impact your life, not just in your practice. As a professor and researcher, Stephan's eye for detail and spoken delivery of ideas and insights was such a delight. The clarity and conciseness of the different topics we discussed was so refreshing, and I'm looking forward to a round 2 of our conversation. So without further ado, please enjoy this inside look with Stephan Naji.
My name is Stephan Naji. I was born in the US, in Columbia, Maryland, but I was raised in France. I was born from a French mother and an Iraqi father, so I have kind of a multicultural upbringing, even though my main culture, I would say, is French, ultimately. Since I don't really have rooted ties to the US, it was mostly a French upbringing. I mention it because it's key to my professional development, and I guess later on my Budo development. I'm a bioarchaeologist, which means that's what happens when you get trained as a classic archaeologist and then move on to biological anthropology. So what I study as a professional is what we call skeletal biology. So the study of human bones, both in archaeological context, so in the past, and also in a forensic context, in the medical legal setting. I've been trained both in France and the US, again, for similar reason, because I have a dual citizenship. I was always keen on learning from different sources and trying to achieve my goals from very perpendicular, transverse angles always, not trying to follow the main road, trying to find alternative options. So after I've exhausted the French system with my first master, I realized that I needed something a bit more and a change of perspective. So I moved to the US to continue my training in biological anthropology. And then I came back to France, mostly for financial reasons, because the US at the PhD level becomes so ridiculously expensive that it was more interesting to go back to France, where universities are basically free. So it was, and pretty much at the same level. So it was another move in my academic development. I don't have any interesting origin stories for my Budo life. It was actually pretty childish because as a kid, since I was about 12 or 13, I was a huge nerd playing role-playing games, video games, and very much attracted to Japanese anime and manga, which were fairly popular in France in the 80s and 90s. And so...
Which ones in particular?
Well, the main one was Dragon Ball. That was the huge thing. And I must have been 12 when it first aired in France. And then I went on and bought the actual Japanese manga, even though I couldn't read them. I still had them, so it was just leaf through them and read them that way, just to get ahead of the anime and know what was going to happen. So, but because I was playing fantasy role-playing games, I was really interested in medieval context, and that's actually one of my key lead to becoming an archaeologist, because I was a history buff even in primary school and early days of high school. And because I wanted to understand the context of my role-playing games in medieval times, I actually started to specialize in medieval archaeology and in military architecture, so the Templars and stuff like that. So I was attracted to swords, medieval European swords, very quickly, and I started collecting swords like the Spanish Toledo replicas that we can find all over Europe when I was late teenager, early adult, I guess, early 20s. So I always had a sword interest, but more from a European military perspective at first. When I returned, and I wasn't doing any Budo when I was a teenager. I was mainly in track and field. That was the only thing I was good at, 100 meters, long jump, stuff like that, which I practiced a little bit in high school and a little bit at the university level. But I got a knee injury doing some silly basketball stuff, and so I had to cut that short. So when I left for my master's in the US in 99, I had no Budo experience except dabbling in karate when I was a kid, but that doesn't really count. And when I returned to France in 2003, I was looking for an actual Budo. I was actually thinking about trying to find a kendo club, because finally my interests kind of merged together between the swords and Japan. I've always been a huge fan of Japanese culture through the manga and anime literature, but also through food culture. As a French, that's always one of my interests. So I was a Japanese restaurant critique in France. On my leisurely days, I would go to all the ramen shops and try to see which one was authentic and not, stuff like that. So it was a very basic approach to Japanese culture. So when I tried to merge them together, trying to find a sport, I looked for kendo clubs. So I moved back to Paris in 2003, and as I was looking, kind of randomly going through the streets next to my apartments, going grocery shopping, I found this small private gymnasium with a leaflet on it with a guy wearing a full black hakama and keikogi and with a sword and saying, Iaido, the art of the sword, blah, blah, blah. Class starts next week or something. I was like, wow, I've never seen this before. I was really looking for kendo. That was the only thing I knew. And I thought that might be interesting. So I called in, and it turned out that my first instructor had just put up the leaflet like 3 hours earlier and was literally starting his first class 2 days after that. So I joined in right away, and immediately it felt right. Immediately I loved the teaching parts, the perspective, the sword. It wasn't physical, so I wasn't damaging my knee more than needed, even though my injury is fairly minor. I was conscious of it. So I could feel that I could practice this for a long time, and it just clicked. So that's basically how it started. And then that was 2003. How was I? 28, sorry. And that's it. And since then I've never really started practicing. And it was first Iaido, and then I think a year or two after that, the dojo opened a Jodo section. So we started right away, Iaido and Jodo.
So this was at the school?
So no, this was a privately run dojo. We would just rent the space, and that's it. So that was outside of the school.
Okay. Well, when you said you were going back to France, you were looking for kendo. At that time, were you aware of what Iaido was? And then when you actually found out about it, how did your kind of interest in the sword change? When you were thinking, oh, there's this bamboo thing where I can hit each other, but no, actually, there's this other thing where we just do forms.
Right. Yeah. No, that I was not aware at all of Iaido or Jodo whatsoever. I had some understanding of kendo through not even videos, because it was the early days of the internet. So I don't think I've seen videos there. I don't even remember probably seeing the kendo club in the US. I guess that's probably the best memory I have. But that's it. I had no understanding of Iaido. So when I saw it, it really clicked, because there was the sword component that I knew, and I was already familiar with the Japanese sword system and what it entails on a cultural level, because those are the things that I've looked for just as a hobby. And the martial art aspect was also something that clicked, because I was looking for a martial art, not necessarily a sport. But I didn't know there was this option. So it really clicked. Those two components felt right. And so the form approach made sense, because we had real swords, so I didn't even question it. And this was actually a fairly good process for me because I'm extremely, I think I realized very rapidly that it would be very helpful for my personal development, this kind of inner training and focus and calm. I'm a very nervous person and I react very rapidly. And I was always conscious that I had a hard time controlling some of my feelings and some of my emotional reactions. So it felt like I could use this, even though it wasn't specifically taught that way. It immediately kind of soothed me and calmed me. And so I realized, yeah, I like the feeling. I like the focus. I like the slow building up of skills. I'm a researcher and I'm trying to be extremely meticulous in my work. So I really like to work gradually from the ground up. So if I don't understand something, I always go back to the basics, to the original sources, try to understand where things are coming from, whether it's the etymology of a word or the origin of a scientific concept or whatever. And then I built up my skills on top of this to be able to use that in my regular professional career or now as a technique in Budo. So it felt right. It really, the parallel between my professional life and my Budo experience are strong and are, there's a lot of overlap. And so it clicked that way.
That's really interesting. Could you talk more about that? When they were teaching something, they say, oh, the origins of Iaido was through this time period in Japan, or this kata is supposed to be about this kind of scenario. How did you explore that further? Like, speaking of the ways that you do your work, like what did you look into?
Yeah. So at first, again, it was still the early days of the internet, so I didn't have much opportunity to search that way. But well, actually, one of the key piece of literature that helped me understand Iaido very quickly was Eiji Yoshikawa's novel on Musashi, the dual volume that he wrote late 19th century. And so it's a beautiful novel about Musashi's life. And this was the only kind of historical perspective that I had. So as a historian, I started looking on about the author, then I started looking about Musashi's life, then I found, the Book of Five Rings and stuff like that. And then I quickly realized the Bushido Code and all those kind of easy to access pieces of literature that are kind of the traditional things that people throw at you whenever you speak about samurai and martial arts and stuff like that in Japan. But I was trained as a historian, so I always have a very critical perspective on these things. So very rapidly, I realized that those were romanticized, those were an ideal construct, a modern construct of what feudal Japan looked like. So I really tried to look at it from a historical perspective. I didn't care about what was true or not. I just wanted to make sure that my understanding of what we were doing today in Iaido, where did it fit? So rapidly, I found sources about the history of the ZNKR, about how my Koryu line, Musoshinden no Ryu, was invented very late century, and how this all fitted together. So I was very realistic about what I was doing. There was I wasn't trying to replicate any fantasy about samurais or anything like this. I didn't care about that. Even though, because I was a role-playing game addict, dressing up and playing with sword was always fun. So I can't say that wasn't part of the appeal. But yeah, again, it was at first, the first couple of years, I tried to use the resource that I had. Now, in the past five or so years, well, 10 years, I guess, with the full development of the internet and access to huge resources of information, it was really fun to dig into proper resources and access and discuss with some of my senseis, discuss with whomever had some knowledge about what we were doing and the meaning behind what we were doing and why we were doing it. So there's so much out there that it was fairly easy to access two kind of sources. First, the language. I have no Japanese. I don't speak Japanese. I've learned a little bit. I've mostly, as most of us, technical words. I can easily describe how to kill in 3 different ways someone, but I probably can't order a drink. So it's not very useful Japanese vocabulary. But because I like language, I speak a couple of languages because I've worked in several countries. I always had this appeal to understand the etymology of the words. So whenever we were using, I was actually a little bit surprised at first that in dojo we conserved the Japanese vocabulary for techniques, the word translated. And so when I questioned that, I realized that, of course, it's to give us kind of a homogenized understanding of and a common language to describe things that are inherently Japanese. So that makes total sense. It also preps us for national seminars when there's a Japanese delegation coming in. And usually the translation is not complete because they keep the Japanese technical terms when they translate in whatever language. So it helps us with this. But then deconstructing the words themselves really help understand the technique. And so understanding, it's not because we use a Japanese word that there's any mystical meaning to it. It's just a word. And we were discussing this actually last night with Andy Watson Sensei during the end of one of our Zoom class. And it's just a word. So it's just usually a descriptor of what you're supposed to be. But because it's just a word, of course, there's plenty of variation in the interpretation of what that means, a personal interpretation. And so it's interesting to understand these variations of interpretation from just a simple word that describes a specific technique.
Could you bring up one word as an example?
Yeah, yesterday we were talking about Chibori and the differences in grips that we have. So I was asking the difference between Shimeru and Chibori, and then of course the broader Tenouchi, and because we were discussing originally the difference between Tomete and Kirite, the wrist movements, the wrist position you're supposed to show, the differences you're supposed to show depending on the movement you're doing. And I was just illustrating the fact that sometimes I hear foreigners like me using the wrong definition for a specific technical term. So, for example, using the Chibori definition of wringing the towel for Shimeru, which apparently means just squeezing or gripping, which is not exactly the same. There's no twisting action. It's not exactly the same movement. And the way that it's applied in various martial arts. So in Kendo, they use Chibori apparently even for cutting, which in Iai, most people, at least that's what was told, should not be using this particular term or technique for the cutting, because it's more general tenouchi, and eventually, Watson Sensei mentioned kakaru, just the slight touching of the saya with your left hand, and gentle squeezing instead of hard grip. And so all those very small differences in translation make a whole difference in how you practice, because it completely changes actual technical pathways, because you're not implementing the same muscles, you're not using the same muscles, you're not implementing the same sequences. So either you do a hard grip with your 5 fingers at once, like in Chibori, where it's the whole grip hand that is engaged, or you use a more subtle, small finger, ring finger, middle finger sequence of squeezing, which is a much more subtle action. So this was of interest to me, first at my level to progress, of course, but also in general as a scholar, because I'm interested in such finer nuance, because I want to make sure that when I use a word or when I talk about a concept, I know where it's coming from. So I guess this first dimension of sources, the Japanese language itself, is deep enough that you can get completely buried under the information. And then there's, of course, the historical aspect of it. Who were our sensei's lineage? Why are we doing this particular kata in the ZNKR forms? Its relationship in my lineage with Muso Shinden and the various levels. So understanding this is also very important for me at least, to understand the variations and to understand why it has evolved and why it has, in most cases, nothing to do with battlefield or any, kind of idealized samurai way of killing people or whatever. But it's just basically some technical exercise to get your body prepped, just in case, to be ready, to be adaptable, to be one of the reading of Iaido. So be ready whenever, at all time, to react appropriately. So I really like that. That was a nice layered path, I guess, for me, where we have the technical component of learning a form, the choreography of a kata, with its hurdles, with its physical hurdles, with its mental hurdles of understanding timing, of understanding synchronizing movements or desynchronizing upper body, lower body, and then resynchronizing it at another level. Those challenges were extremely interesting at a personal level. And then there was the whole broader historical, cultural, linguistic context around it that I was always fascinated by. So yeah, it really made sense for me to just go into this weird, dressed up martial arts, sword around in a dojo. So it makes sense.
And hearing about the type of work that you do, where you have to be very meticulous in looking at details and very discerning of things, that when you're looking at data, one thing could mean one thing, something else could mean another thing. It makes kind of a lot of sense that this is something that attracts you. It's also interesting because when we first learn Iaido, we don't realize there's so much depth to where it comes from. Could you talk about how in the beginning when you're learning, of course, it feels like there's just so much information. Gradually, how did you kind of decide on, how did this become more of a kind of a stable thing where it's no longer something fresh and new and something you're discovering and something that, okay, it's just a regular part of your life?
Yeah, good question. Actually, I've reflected on it probably when you've asked me to come on the podcast, because I started putting thoughts together. And I think there are two components to it. The first one that I actually wanted to mention here is the community aspect of Iaido, of Budo in general. This was key for me for several reasons. As I've mentioned before, in my professional career, I was always keen on reaching out internationally and also cross-disciplinary, meaning that even though I was an archaeologist, I wanted to be trained in another field, which is biological anthropology. And then I kept reaching boundaries and disciplinary, because I really like this cross-disciplinary approach. And also because of my multicultural upbringing, I really always I've always reached out to other countries and other people as different as possible as me, just to understand their perspective, because this is so enriching that it always teaches you something fundamental about your own growth. And I've applied this to Iaido. Well, I didn't apply it. I kind of fell into it because luckily the dojo I signed up, the first dojo I signed up in Paris was part of the Ishido sensei lineage in Europe. So from, I think, my second year, I guess from 2004 and on, I've attended European seminars when Ishido sensei was coming, whether in England, in the Netherlands. Fortunately, I think for 2 years, 2004 and 5 or 5 and 6, Ishido sensei also came to France because his representative in France organized also a private seminar. So I was from the very start exposed to the European and Jodo. And because I'm lucky enough to speak a couple of languages, I was able to just go over there and start speaking to all of them. And in addition to this exposure through seminars, I was lucky because in the French dojo in Paris, we had a British practitioner who came, Al Colborne, because he was working in Paris. He found a job in France, came over, and our dojo was recommended, so he started training with us. And he really acted as a senpai to me. Those first years, he was ahead of me. He's now Rokudan in Jodo and Godan in Iai, I think. Yeah, he hasn't passed his Rokudan in Iai. And at the time, he was probably Samdan or something in both. But he's younger, he's much fitter. So he has a beautiful Iai and Jo. And because I was probably one of the only one in the dojo speaking half of this in English, we could communicate because he doesn't have any French. And so we became friends fairly rapidly. And through him, he introduced me kind of to the British crowd every time we would go on seminars. And so I was lucky to be introduced very early on to influential sensei such as Hobson Sensei, who became my sensei 2 years ago, and Watson Sensei, and basically a lot of people from the BKA, which are all wonderful, generous people. So I was always lucky to be able to hang out with them, beers, and this exposure, both at the dojo through Al and through European seminars, immediately taught me a sense of how it's really a family. It's an extra family for us. Personally, I don't need to make friends. I'm lucky to have a very rich social network. I have a group of friends that I've known, about 12 of them, that I've known since I was in primary school, since I was 10, 12 years old. And we still hang out on a regular basis. And this is my primary social group. I have a family. I have 2 daughters, I'm married. I'm lucky that my parents are still alive. So I have a rich family experience. So I don't need an extra social circle. But we spend so much time practicing in the dojo, traveling to national, international seminars, going to Taikai. This has a huge toll on our personal circles. And unlike you're very fortunate that you can come and practice with your wife, and you come along with your kids. So that's a great. I'm really glad when I saw you do this in the US. It was like, yeah, that's great, because you can combine those two and you don't lose anything, or not too much. There's always some trade-offs, I guess. But the point is, very rapidly, you need to feel comfortable socially with everyone you're practicing, because it's half the experience. I mean, I don't really travel to European seminars to practice. My motivation is I travel to meet people, starting, of course, with sensei, because it's still a very valuable teaching opportunity. Because I can't go every year to Japan. I've only gone thrice to Japan to train. Every opportunity I have to hear what sensei can say is a great opportunity. But mass seminars is not really a place for deep learning. So if I don't have the motivation of actually meeting people that hopefully throughout the years became friends, or at least they're always fun to hang out with, restaurants, at bars after the training, why bother? Why would I spend all this time outside of my social circle, which is fairly rich, and I'm fairly fulfilled with it outside of Budo? I still spend a huge amount of my time outside of this circle. So community was crucial to my long-term commitment to Budo. If I didn't have this, I would have gave up years ago, for sure. And one of the clearest, I guess, illustration for this, which surprised me in a good way, I guess. My first couple of years as a Mudan Shodan in Iaido, I participated to several Taikais, European Championship, my French national Taikais, and also in 2005, I went to the World Taikai, International Taikai that the BKA organized, which was a wonderful event with, I can't remember how many countries, but probably at least 20 countries represented, including the US, Australia. I don't remember Canada. I don't know if there was anyone from Canada, but there might have been. I don't know if you remember that or not. But
I know Michael Hodge went to something.
Right. So because there was,
I think it was a Koryu Taikai.
Okay,
Was this
there was
one?
several. No, that was not a Koryu Taikai. That was just an international Seitei Taikai. But anyway, so it was a wonderful, and there's huge Japanese delegation, of course, under the guidance of Ishido Sensei, multi-Koryu representation. It was a wonderful event. And in my little Mudan category, I met a US guy, was there, Kailan, that you know well. And we started talking, and you know him, he's extremely friendly. So we started talking to each other, and that was in 2005. And then we kind of kept touch, once in a while through Facebook, just like this, nothing very formal, but it turned out to be a critical part of my training, because when I returned to the US for a job in 2015, so 10 years after, the first person I contacted, because I was moving back to New York City and I knew he was living there, was Aram. And I emailed him and said, hey, I'm going to be in the city. Well, actually, it was in 2012. I had an internship in New York at the medical examiner's office. And I said, I'm going to be in New York for a month. We should meet up for a beer, and I'll be interested if I can come and watch some of your training. And I said, no. You don't come and watch our training. You come and train. And I said, I can't bring my equipment because it's a hassle. And you don't find excuse. I'll bring you a hakama. I'll bring you a sword, and you'll train. And I said, hi, senpai. And I just came, and I went to the dojo, and of course I contacted through him. He asked authorization with Kato sensei if I could come up and train. There was no issue. So I trained, I think, twice with them, which was amazing. And then 3 years later, when I returned I moved back to the US for my job. Well, of course, he was my direct contact. So I officially asked through my sensei who I could train with, and everybody pointed directly at Kato sensei for obvious reason if you're in the US, because he's an amazing sensei. He's also my Koryu lineage, Muso Shinden Ryu, so it was an easy fit. And because I had already met him through Aram when I came in 2012. So this is just to say that without even doing anything, I was already I hadn't realized I was ingrained in a Budo community that stretched everywhere. And through proper connections, if you follow the proper etiquette and you don't mess around, with a few phone calls, you can be introduced anywhere and find an actual community. And I was welcome in the US in an amazing way. This was a critical developmental step for me when I started training in the US, because in France, I had moved a couple of times. And so I had to train in several dojo. And so I was kind of in a limbo of sort in terms of sensei. I was still practicing at the European seminars under sensei's lineage, but I didn't have an official sensei anymore. And so it was kind of hard to, without my personal connections, especially through the BKA people, and especially through the very benevolent guiding of Hobson Sensei and Watson Sensei and my senpai Holborn, I would have been a bit lost. I might have dropped out of Budo. But moving to the US and being welcome at Kato Sensei's dojo, which is an amazing dojo in terms of skills, in terms of people, and as importantly, at the same time, I was also introduced to Parker Sensei at Kenzen Dojo, where she immediately invited me to train in her dojo as well, even though she's Jikiden Ryu line. She said, you can come practice Sete with us. That would be great. And because she has her hands on a lot of things, she also wanted me to come and train with them in Jodo, because Kato Sensei was not practicing Jodo at their dojo. And Parker Sensei was trying to create some inertia to build up a Jodo federation in the US, which to my understanding still doesn't really exist officially. But she wanted to have some students that are not beginners anymore to start the first Jodo seminars in the US. And so because I was only Nidan when I arrived, but I was still the senior in this at Kenzen. So she asked me if I could help teach Jodo class, which was a brand new thing for me because I had never taught Jodo before. I taught Iaido before, but not Jodo. And I said, if I can help, the first class I arrived and she was like, dozo. I'm like, okay, let's get to it. So that was kind of stage one, this warm, generous welcome from, two amazing nanadans, Kato Sensei and Parker Sensei, and finding immediately a fully built community was amazing. I've lived 5 years in New York. I've barely made any US friends outside of the dojo. But in the dojo, I had a very rich social life as well, very comparable to what I had before in France. And again, this sense of community, this sense of social connection was critical to keep me going, to keep, waking up Sunday mornings for Keiko and several times a week and truck through the snow in New York City to go to the dojo. You need some motivation, and the community was key in this regard. So at a personal level, what I had felt originally, this inner practice, especially in Iaido, was my original impetus to train and change my character and build confidence and overcome some of what I felt like kind of emotional weaknesses. That was, and I could feel some progress. Still a long way to go, but it was definitely something that kept me going. But the sense of community and the number of people I've met, wonderful people. I mean, on average, 95% of the people I've met in the Buddha community are all wonderful people. And so that's probably the biggest motivation today, is to continue to interact with these people and learn from them from various perspectives. So yeah, that was a key developmental stage.
And it seems that when we talk about this community and this social group in Iaido or Jodo Kendo, it's not just the social, it's not just having fun with each other, because if you give an example of Aram forcing you to go to the dojo and Parker Sensei just dropping this responsibility of teaching on you, there's something more than just having fun with each other. It seems like as a community, we're all trying to get better. We're all building each other. So we're propping each other up. If someone's dragging behind, then we pull them up. If we're feeling a little low, then someone else will pull us up. It's more than just, having fun.
Yeah, that's exactly it. you've put it beautifully. We have a common goal. We all aspire to become better, to put it, in a cheesy way. We all want to become better persons. But the community aspect of it is that we're never alone. And so personally, I've never understood people who practiced kind of on, in their cave, in their little personal hole, and want to hug knowledge, want to, stay isolated. This is for me a complete paradoxical approach to Budo. But even if I say this, I don't judge, because we all have our own way, and there's no better ways. No one's ways is better than the others. So that's fine. But at least from the start, I realized that I don't want to go that way. I want to go through the community way. I want to go through the sharing of knowledge. I want to go through the. At first, it was in the US for 5 years. I was teaching at the university level, so I was a professor at NYU. And when I teach at the university, I always try to learn from my students, even though the level of knowledge is more akin to a Nanadan teaching a Shodan, because when you teach freshmen undergrads, they really know nothing, and so you really have to be very basic. But even in this context, I try to keep an open mind, and I want to learn from their personal experience. Of course, I'm not going to learn about my field, but their questions about my field, their very basic, naive questions about my field, forces me to make sure that what I understand of my field is correct, precise, accurate, and that I can give it back in a format that's digestible to anyone. And of course, that's fully translatable, I guess, to Budo. At first, I would teach with this in mind. If I teach a beginner, what can I learn from them? Now, I'm trying to not even think about that. I'm just giving away whatever I have, and whatever bounces back, I'm happy to take. But this change in perspective really came through Kato Sensei and Parker Sensei's teaching. Parker Sensei so it was really interesting to train in both of those dojo, because they had a completely different approach to teaching. Kato Sensei seems to be much more traditional in the Japanese teaching, where he doesn't explain much. He teaches by example. There's a beautiful Iaido example, and you're supposed to pick up the points, and then he would point, your foot, your hand, say a few words, and then I had the chance to have all those wonderful senpais to look at and pick which one I would want to look like and reproduce, their forms, because it's a fully structured dojo from Nanadans all the way to Shodan. I think all the dans are represented there. So it was a wonderful opportunity. Likewise, in Kenzen, with Parker Sensei, he had from Nanadans to Shodan, every dance was represented. So it was a very rich structure, which allowed you to really see, I think some of your guests mentioned this before, but in Japan, what you're supposed to be doing at every dan level. Sandan, Yondan, Godan, Rokudan, you can see the difference in your senpais and your sensei, and that really gives you a structured goal to aim your practice. Within this, Parker Sensei was much more Western in her teaching, and I guess also because of her professional teaching, she really liked to deconstruct things and go at it at 10 different angles at the same time, giving you a breadth of perspective that was amazing to watch. And she also emphasized teaching how to teach to the seniors in the dojo. And she was generous enough to include me, even though I was a guest at her dojo. She very rapidly put me, because I was Yondan in Iaido at the time, she put me on the Tosaki side, on the sensei side, to help teach with all the other wonderful sensei that were there. So she pulled me up by, again, giving me responsibility, but not blindly, not dumping them on me, by very carefully and gradually teaching me how to take on those responsibilities. And this was a wonderful learning curve and growth for me, to be able to be guided by such a wonderful sensei within such wonderful senseis within these two dojos. And so, I mean, this is how I think I converted from a student to more of a teacher, and where I could parallel my professional teaching career with now my Budo teaching career. Not career, but path, I guess. And so this parallel and overlap really made it part of my life. I mean, this is why now I would not dream of dropping training, because it really is a piece of the puzzle within my complete mental building process that has to be there for me to be balanced. I just want to mention also in Jodo in particular, another huge shout out at our Jodo teacher, Jodo sensei, Mike Scott sensei, who was kind enough to help Kenzen and Parker sensei build up the Jodo skills by coming from New Jersey to train with us on Sundays and built up our level. Mike sensei is more of a Koryu person and is Menkyo and Ishido Muso, Ryu Jodo. And when I arrived, again, I was only Nidan. I was fairly square in my technical approach, thanks to the European level teaching of Jodo. So I knew what I was doing in terms of ZNKR Jodo for my level, of course, for a very beginner's level. And Mike Sensei, what he explained was at some point he was not interested in practicing Seitei Jodo anymore. And he really dedicated his training much more to Koryu than anything else. But because Parker Sensei asked him to help in Seitei Jodo, he went back to it and taught them that. And so when I arrived, very rapidly we realized there was some techniques that didn't fit. I was doing certain moves that was really different from what he was doing, but he's so senior to me, then of course I just shut up and did what he told us to do. But the amazing change I've seen over the 5 years, and I really mean this as a huge compliment, is that even Mike Sensei changed his own practice while he was practicing with us beginners in Seitei Jodo, because he was open enough, generous enough, and as we usually say, the traditional metaphor of coming in at a practice with your bowl empty. He would even do this even after something like 5 decades of training, including a couple in Japan and mastering several Koryu in several martial arts. He would still come with us, Shodan, Nidan, Mudan, and apparently learn from us, because he repeatedly said that now he started to understand how the technical committee of the ZNKR Jodo Federation put so much thought into Seitei Jodo, that all comes from Shinto Muso Ryu, that it couldn't be just random choreography. It has to have a deeper meaning to it. Even though the technique seems simple, of course, they have layered, in-depth meanings like any other ZNKR kata. But and I'm sorry if I'm misinterpreting what Mike Sensei told us, but it seemed that at some point in his training, he kind of dropped it because he didn't see that. And by retraining on a regular basis with us, he started to gradually realize that, yeah, there are things. And he put in the effort to make a synthesis of his Koryu approach with ZNKR Jodo and find ways to integrate our variation, our differences within his teaching. And that was a wonderful teaching moment, because then I realized, wow, if you really put the efforts and you really stay open-minded, then you can and try to understand the logic and the roots of what people are practicing. And we go back to what we were saying at the beginning, how I really like to go back to the roots of things. This was another click moment where I realized, yeah, by doing this, you can remain open-minded and integrate anything that any sensei can teach you in your practice. And suddenly you're not in a conflict, oppositional mode of my sensei is doing this, so anything else is crap and I won't practice it. Bugger off, you're not my sensei, I'm not going to listen to you, even though you're talking to a Hachidan Hanchi in Iai who's telling you, your foot should be 45 degree and not 30 degree, and you're saying, yeah, I don't care, my sensei said 30 degrees, so I'm not going to listen. This was how I was originally taught. Follow your lineage, strictly. Everything else, discard. And it never really felt right. Through my US experience, through Kato Sensei, Parker Sensei, and Scott Sensei teaching in generosity and open-mindedness, I found a way to convert that initial understanding of learning into a much richer learning experience, where Today, anyone senior to me can teach me a point. I will take it as an exercise, even if it's completely different than what Ishido Sensei is teaching, what Hobson Sensei is teaching, or Watson Sensei is teaching. It doesn't matter. It's a great exercise. If I'm not able to train in it and implement it on a regular basis, then I'm not flexible enough. I'm stuck in a form, and that's for me not a good growth path. I need to be, well, I don't need to be, but I feel like being adaptable and flexible enough to integrate any change in your practice is the interesting process. The process of, are you able to change on the spot during this seminar right now, your technique, and then maybe revert back to what Sensei is telling you? Doesn't matter. Now you have a new tool. Now you have maybe a new kihon. Now you have a new variation that you can use to understand why are you doing this specific cut? Why are you doing this specific turn? Why are you, doing this specific technique? And not just because Sensei told me so. And this was really a leap in my understanding. I don't know if it reflects in my practice. Probably not yet. But after I passed Godan 2 years ago, I decided that for my Rokudan in Iai, this would be my training process. I would completely deconstruct all my seite kata and all my koryu kata and try to understand and try to find a way to make it personal. I guess that's one of the goals at Rokudan and up level, is to demonstrate that you can interpret the kata in your own way.
Mm-hmm. This attitude of flexibility is so wonderful and important, and it's something that you don't see when you first enter the martial arts, because it's like supposedly this rigid thing where you're doing drills and you have to follow a certain curriculum. But I think that's a reflection of these great senseis that you've had the privilege of training with, and also yourself being so open to their guidance, being open to understanding that you can still learn from anyone. I feel like we can talk for another hour, but we're approaching the end of this hour. Yeah. I would love to have you on again to continue discussion, because there's other lines that I wanted to talk about. But to wrap this one up, just as like a first one, I'd like to ask you a couple just quick and more fun questions.
Sure.
So the first one is, do you have a quote or proverb that you live by or practice by?
Not really. I mean, I think, and I can never remember it, the actual reading of Iaido, maybe you know the sentence, I'm completely blanking it, but one way to interpret it, being ready at all time to react appropriately. The origin of E and I, another reading for the kanji, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking the sentence, is now something that I'm trying to really, I don't want to say embody, but live by when I train. So that would be it.
I think you might have written it as "Tune ni ite kyu ni awase." Was that?
Yes, that's the one. That's one of the translation interpretation of Iaido. I know there are a couple of them, but I really like this one because it illustrates well, both professionally and in Budo, what I've been trying to do without necessarily knowing it. And now that I am conscious of it, I'm trying to implement it systematically. Yes.
Hmm. If there's a sensei or practitioner that you've never met before that you can have a day-long conversation with, regardless of language barrier, who might that be?
I think for historical reason, might be Nakayama Hakudo sensei, because he was such instrumental in shaping up modern Iaido Kendo and Jodo that I would be really interested to understand his motivation, his inner struggle to come up with these completely new systems, schools, and so yeah, probably him would be a really interesting starting point.
Cool. Have you been to Tokyo?
Yes.
All right. So question: Tokyo restaurants, New York restaurants, or Paris restaurants, and why?
A good one. The one thing that I miss about New York are the restaurants, because it's probably the one city on earth where there are so many foreign communities with their own foreign cooking and not adapted to Western palates, especially not adapted to US taste. That would be a crime from a French standard, unfortunately. but bringing their own cuisine to New York inside their community created a sense of you can walk 3 blocks and travel 3 countries and eat 3 completely authentic food from 3 completely different continents. And that was an amazing experience. So New York, that's what I miss the most. But Paris, even though it doesn't have the same diversity, the quality is so much higher. You can go into any little cafe, and even if they just cook you some steak and fries, it will be much better quality, much cheaper than what you can get in New York, at least for the same price. Now, Tokyo is kind of the same as Paris, less diversity, but the quality is always there. And even if some cheap street food, vendor, the cook are always going to pay very close attention to any little details on the dish. Not in a fancy way, but if they're going to put something in it, it's not for show, it's for taste. And so the food there was just amazing. And I think I spent 3/4 of my budget on food in Japan every time I go there. It's, I've even dropped some Budo equipment just to go to restaurants the last time I was there. So yeah, they each have their pluses, yeah.
Yeah, and after this lockdown is over, we're totally going back to all those. Hopefully not too many of them go under.
Yeah, that's in New York. I'm sure a lot of them are going to go under because of the rental system and the craziness of the price. In France, they're a little bit protected, so some will go under, but a lot of them are protected, so they should survive. I don't know what the Tokyo situation or Japan situation is, but yeah, hopefully we'll be able to return.
Yeah, I think they never really fully locked down in Tokyo.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, so somehow they managed. Okay, so just a final question. Is there any comment or thing that you want to say to the audience that you want to share right now? We'll have other opportunities in the future, but how would you like to close this off?
I really think, the main point that we've addressed is if you want support during your training in Budo, you'll have it because there's such a huge, friendly, welcoming community throughout the world, and especially in Europe. Ishido Sensei's lineage alone is very often described as a family because he has so many Monjin, direct students, Jikimon, now they're called, and students of students, and 3 generations down, that anywhere you go, you can find a dojo to practice in where you feel safe, where you feel welcome. And even outside of this particular family, through the European Championship, through international European seminars, everybody's welcome. And there's such a strong support that, in doubt, if you think you're going to drop out of Budo, just reach out and you'll find someone to help you and bring you along.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. So yeah, hopefully we can have another conversation. I'm so glad we can manage this, and hopefully your trip back to the city is okay, and then you stay safe.
Thank you. Yeah. You too. Thank you for having me. And thank you for the podcast. It's fun to be able to hear some of our friends interview. So it's a great thing. Good luck with that.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for sharing your story too.
My pleasure.
So I'll talk to you again soon. Bye. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode because we have a lot more exciting conversations to share as we explore the world of the traditional Japanese martial arts. The Inside Look podcast is available on most common podcasting platforms and on YouTube. Remember to subscribe to not miss out on new interviews as they are posted. We're always looking for feedback to improve, so please write us a review or drop us a line at podcast@tokushikai.ca or on Facebook and Instagram at tokushikai.canada. Until next time, thanks for listening.